You're hearing one version of the story about UFC 328, but behind the scenes, there's a completely different conversation, and it's getting louder. On the surface, everything looks normal. Big card, big promotion. Same machine you expect from the Ultimate Fighting Championship. But if you zoom in just a little, the signals don't match the hype. Ticket movement? Slower than expected. Secondary market? Not exactly exploding. And insiders aren't brushing it off. They're watching it. Now here's where it flips. Because while people are focused on numbers, something else just added fuel to this situation. And it involves Sean Strickland. Not inside the octagon. Outside it. A heated altercation. Real tension. The kind of moment that usually boosts attention, but this time, it's raising questions instead. Why? Because there's a growing sense that controversy alone isn't moving the needle the way it used to. Not in this fight landscape. Not when audiences have more options, more noise, more fights every single weekend. Even boxing has been creeping back into the spotlight with unexpected matchups pulling casual viewers in different directions. So now you've got two storylines colliding. One, an event that should feel massive, but isn't generating the urgency people expected. Two, a fighter known for intensity creating headlines, but not necessarily translating into momentum for the card. And here's the part nobody's really saying out loud. Is the UFC starting to feel the pressure of its own schedule? Too many events, not enough separation, and suddenly, even big names aren't hitting the same. Because if UFC 328 doesn't turn this around quickly, this isn't just about one event. It's about a shift. And if you're only looking at the surface, you're missing what's really going on. The more you look at UFC 328, the harder it becomes to ignore the disconnect between what's being promoted and what's actually happening underneath. On paper, this is supposed to be another high-energy showcase from the Ultimate Fighting Championship, a brand that rarely misses when it comes to drawing attention. But the early signals around this event aren't lining up with that reputation. Ticket sales aren't collapsing, but they're not surging either, and that middle ground is exactly what's making people uneasy. Because for an organization built on momentum, anything less than strong demand starts to raise eyebrows. What's interesting is how quietly this conversation is unfolding. You're not hearing it in official promos. You're not seeing it highlighted in flashy countdown segments. But within circles that track fight business closely, there's a noticeable hesitation. It's not panic. It's curiosity mixed with concern. The kind of reaction that says, something feels off, but we're not ready to call it yet. And that's where things start to get more complicated. Because this isn't happening in isolation. The fight landscape right now is more crowded than it's been in years. Between weekly UFC cards, rising competition, and boxing putting together unexpected crossover moments, fans are being asked to choose more often than ever before. And when that happens, attention gets split. Even loyal audiences start prioritizing. They pick the fights that feel must-watch, and skip the ones that don't. That's a subtle shift, but it has real consequences. Now layer in the situation involving Sean Strickland, and things get even more unpredictable. Normally, a heated altercation tied to a recognizable name would inject immediate energy into an event. It would dominate headlines, spark debate, and push curiosity through the roof. But this time, the reaction feels different. People are paying attention, yes, but they're not necessarily converting that attention into excitement for the card itself. And that gap is what's catching insiders off guard. Part of it comes down to familiarity. Strickland isn't new to controversy. His persona has always been intense, unpredictable, and outspoken. So when another incident surfaces, it doesn't carry the same shock value it might have once had. Instead of feeling like a sudden explosion, it registers more like a continuation of something people have already seen. And in a media environment where novelty drives engagement, that difference matters more than most realize. At the same time, there's a broader question forming around how much controversy actually moves the needle in today's fight culture. There was a time when a single heated moment could redefine an entire event's trajectory. Now, with constant content and non-stop headlines, even dramatic incidents can get absorbed into the noise. Fans react quickly, but they also move on quickly. And if that reaction doesn't translate into ticket purchases or sustained interest, its impact becomes more limited than expected. That brings everything back to UFC 328 itself. Because when an event isn't getting a natural surge from its lineup, and external drama isn't providing the boost it typically would, the pressure shifts back to the fundamentals. Matchmaking, stakes, storylines that feel real, not manufactured. And if any of those elements feel even slightly off, the audience notices. There's also the question of timing. With so many events packed into the calendar, even a strong card can struggle if it lands in the wrong window. Fans don't just look at one event in isolation. They compare it to what came before and what's coming next. If something bigger is on the horizon, or if the previous card delivered a stronger emotional payoff, it can subtly reduce the urgency to engage with what's right in front of them. None of this means UFC 328 is destined to underperform. Momentum can shift quickly in this sport. A single viral moment, a compelling storyline, or a late promotional push can change the entire trajectory. But the fact that these questions are being asked at all is what makes this situation worth paying attention to. Because it suggests that the usual formula, the one that's worked so consistently, isn't hitting quite the same way this time. And when that happens, even slightly, it opens the door to a much bigger conversation. Not just about one event, but about how fight promotion itself might be evolving in real time. What makes this situation more intriguing is how quickly momentum can shift once a narrative starts to stick. Right now, UFC 328 is hovering in that uncomfortable space where nothing is officially wrong, but nothing feels electric either. And in the Ultimate Fighting Championship ecosystem, that middle ground is dangerous. Because this brand has trained its audience to expect urgency, events that feel like you have to watch, not something you might catch later. When that urgency fades, even slightly, it creates a ripple effect that goes beyond just one card. You can see this ripple forming in how fans are talking about the event. Not with outrage, not with overwhelming hype, just a kind of hesitation. And hesitation is the one thing fight promotion can't afford. It slows down ticket decisions. It softens online buzz. It turns what should feel like a countdown into something that feels optional. And once an event starts to feel optional, the promotional machine has to work twice as hard to reignite that spark. Now bring Strickland back into the picture, because his situation adds another layer that's harder to control. The altercation itself grabbed attention, no question. Clips circulated, reactions poured in, and for a moment, it felt like the kind of chaos that usually fuels fight week energy. But here's the twist. Attention doesn't always equal momentum. In fact, sometimes it creates distraction instead of direction. People aren't just asking what happened. They're asking what it means. Is this building towards something connected to the event, or is it just another standalone moment in a long line of headlines? And when fans can't clearly connect the drama to the stakes of the fight card, the impact becomes diluted. It becomes content instead of a catalyst. That distinction matters more than it seems, especially in a landscape where fans are constantly deciding what deserves their full attention. At the same time, the broader combat sports world isn't standing still. Boxing has been quietly regaining traction with matchups that feel unpredictable, sometimes even chaotic in a way that captures casual interest. These aren't always the most technically significant fights, but they create curiosity, and curiosity drives clicks, views, and conversations. When that energy pulls even a fraction of the audience away, it forces MMA events to compete in a way they didn't have to before. There's also the issue of saturation, and it's becoming harder to ignore. The UFC has built an incredibly consistent schedule, delivering events almost every week. That consistency is a strength, but it can also blur the lines between what's special and what's routine. When fans are given so much content, the threshold for what feels like a must-watch keeps rising. And if a card doesn't clearly cross that threshold, it risks getting lost in the cycle. This is where matchmaking becomes critical, not just in terms of skill level, but in terms of narrative clarity. Fans need a reason to care beyond rankings or records. They need stakes that feel immediate, rivalries that feel real, or consequences that extend beyond a single night. Without that, even talented fighters can struggle to generate the kind of emotional investment that drives ticket sales and viewership. What's happening around UFC 328 suggests that this balance might be slightly off. Not broken, not failing, but not perfectly aligned either. And in a system that relies on precision, even small misalignments can have noticeable effects. That's why insiders are paying attention, even if the broader audience hasn't fully caught on yet. Because here's the underlying concern that isn't being openly discussed. If events start relying too heavily on brand recognition alone, without consistently delivering that sense of urgency, the audience's behavior begins to change. Slowly at first, subtly, but over time, it adds up. Fans become more selective, more willing to skip, more focused on highlights instead of full experiences. And once that shift takes hold, it becomes harder to reverse. Not impossible, but it requires a recalibration. A return to what makes an event feel essential rather than optional. And that's where UFC 328 becomes more than just a single date on the calendar. It becomes a snapshot of where the promotion stands in this moment, balancing its established dominance with the evolving expectations of its audience. The real question isn't whether this event will succeed or struggle. It's what its performance might reveal about the direction things are heading. Because sometimes, the most important signals aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet patterns that only become obvious when you start connecting the dots. And this is where everything starts to tighten, because once patterns begin to repeat, they stop being coincidences and start looking like signals. UFC 328 isn't happening in a vacuum. It's landing at a time when the Ultimate Fighting Championship is balancing two very different pressures. On one side, there's the expectation to keep delivering constant content, to stay visible, to dominate the calendar. On the other, there's the growing need to make each event feel meaningful, distinct, and worth the audience's full attention. And right now, those two goals are starting to pull in opposite directions. Because when you increase volume, you naturally risk reducing impact. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, in ways that are easy to overlook until they start showing up in places like ticket demand and fan engagement. UFC 328 is one of those moments where the tension becomes just visible enough to notice. Not a failure, not a collapse, but a signal that the balance might need adjusting. Now add Strickland back into the equation, and the situation becomes even more layered. His altercation didn't just create headlines, it created a test. A real-time example of how modern fight audiences respond to controversy. And the response has been complicated. People watched, reacted, shared, but they didn't necessarily convert that energy into stronger interest in the event itself. That gap between attention and action is something promoters can't ignore, because it challenges one of the oldest assumptions in combat sports, that any publicity is good publicity. What we're seeing instead is a more selective audience. Fans who are used to constant stimulation, constant headlines, constant drama, and as a result, they become harder to move. It takes more than a viral moment to shift behavior now. It takes connection. stakes. A reason that feels immediate and personal. Without that, even the loudest headlines can fade faster than expected. At the same time, there's a subtle shift happening in how fighters themselves are perceived. Not just based on wins and losses, but on how they fit into the broader entertainment landscape. A fighter can be highly skilled, even dominant, but if their presence doesn't translate into engagement, it creates a different kind of evaluation. And that's where things get tricky, because engagement isn't always predictable. It doesn't follow rankings. It doesn't always reward consistency. Sometimes it comes from unpredictability, sometimes from narrative, sometimes from timing. That unpredictability is exactly what's making this moment feel unstable. Because if the usual indicators, big names, strong records, built-in controversy, aren't guaranteeing momentum, then the system becomes harder to read. And when a system becomes harder to read, it forces everyone involved to rethink their approach. Promoters, fighters, analysts, they all start looking for new patterns, new signals, new ways to understand what actually drives interest. There's also the broader competitive landscape to consider. Combat sports aren't operating in isolation anymore. Boxing is experimenting, adapting, pulling in different audiences with unconventional matchups and cross-promotional energy. Other forms of entertainment are competing for the same attention window. And in that environment, even a dominant brand has to keep evolving to maintain its edge. So UFC 328 becomes more than just an event, it becomes a checkpoint. A moment where small shifts in audience behavior, engagement patterns, and promotional effectiveness all intersect. And while the outcome of this single card won't define anything on its own, the trends surrounding it could point towards something bigger. Because if these patterns continue, if hesitation replaces urgency, if attention doesn't convert into action, if events start feeling interchangeable instead of essential, then the conversation changes. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And once that conversation gains momentum, it influences everything from how fights are booked to how they're marketed. The key detail here is that none of this is happening loudly. There's no major announcement, no clear turning point, no obvious disruption. It's subtle, gradual, the kind of shift that only becomes clear when you step back and look at multiple events, multiple reactions, multiple outcomes. And that's exactly why it matters. Because by the time these changes become obvious to everyone, they're already well underway. And those who recognize the early signals, the quiet hesitation, the unexpected reactions, the gaps between attention and action, are the ones who understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Right now, UFC 328 sits right in the middle of that unfolding story. And now everything circles back to the moment where perception turns into reality. Because once the event actually unfolds, all the speculation, all the quiet concerns, all the subtle signals either get confirmed or completely flipped. UFC 328 is stepping into that exact kind of spotlight, where the outcome won't just be measured by who wins or loses, but by how the entire experience lands with the audience. Did it feel urgent? Did it feel necessary? Or did it feel like something that could have been skipped without missing much? Those are the questions that don't show up in official stats, but they define how an event is remembered. For the Ultimate Fighting Championship, this moment carries more weight than it might seem at first glance. Because when a brand becomes as dominant and consistent as the UFC, expectations don't stay static, they rise. Fans don't just want fights, they want moments. They want something that cuts through everything else competing for their attention. And if an event doesn't deliver that, even if it's technically solid, it can still feel like it fell short. That's the difference between success on paper and success in perception, and right now, that gap is becoming more important than ever. The situation involving Sean Strickland adds another unpredictable layer to this equation. Because when a fighter with that kind of presence is tied to controversy, it creates an expectation of intensity that extends beyond the incident itself. People start watching more closely. They start looking for signs, body language, energy, performance that either match or contradict the narrative that's been built. And if what happens inside the octagon doesn't align with that heightened expectation, the reaction can shift quickly from excitement to disappointment. At the same time, there's a growing awareness that audiences are becoming more experience-driven than ever before. It's not just about individual fights. It's about how the entire card feels from start to finish. Does it build momentum? Does it create tension? Does it deliver moments that stick after it's over? These are the factors that turn a standard event into something memorable. And when those elements are missing or inconsistent, even a card with recognizable names can struggle to leave a lasting impression. This is where the idea of must-watch becomes critical. Not every event needs to be historic, but it needs to feel like it matters in the moment. And that feeling is harder to manufacture than it used to be. It requires alignment between matchmaking, storytelling, timing, and audience expectation. If even one of those elements feels slightly off, the overall impact can shift in ways that are difficult to predict but easy to feel. What makes UFC 328 so important in this context is that it's arriving at a time when these dynamics are becoming more visible. Fans are more vocal. Reactions are faster. Narratives form almost instantly. And once those narratives take hold, they influence how everything is interpreted, from individual performances to the event as a whole. That creates a feedback loop where perception shapes reality just as much as results do. There's also a broader implication that goes beyond this single card. If events start to be judged more on how they feel than on what they deliver statistically, it changes how success is defined. It shifts the focus from consistency to impact, from volume to quality, from expectation to surprise. And that kind of shift doesn't just affect one promotion. It influences the entire combat sports landscape. Because at the end of the day, attention is the most valuable currency in this space. And attention isn't guaranteed, it has to be earned, sustained, and reinforced. UFC has built a system that's incredibly effective at maintaining visibility. But moments like this raise the question of how that visibility translates into engagement. Are fans fully locked in, or are they watching out of habit? That distinction might seem small, but it has long-term consequences. So as UFC 328 unfolds, the real story won't just be inside the cage. It will be in how people react, how they talk about it afterward, how quickly they move on or stay invested. It will be in whether the event reinforces the current model or quietly suggests that something needs to evolve. And those answers won't come from a single headline. They'll come from patterns that start to emerge once everything is over. And if those patterns point in a new direction, even slightly, then this event won't just be remembered for what happened that night. It will be remembered as part of a larger shift that was already in motion, just waiting for the right moment to become impossible to ignore. So here's the real move. Don't just watch the fights, watch the reaction after. Watch how fast people move on. Watch what clips actually go viral. Watch which moments people keep talking about 24 hours later. Because that's where the truth is. If UFC 328 delivers, you'll feel it everywhere. If it doesn't, you'll notice that silence. And that's the shift we're tracking here. So if you want breakdowns that go deeper than headlines, if you want the angles nobody's calling out yet, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay locked in. Drop your take in the comments too. Is this just one-off night? Or are we starting to see cracks in the system? Because trust me, the story around the Ultimate Fighting Championship isn't slowing down anytime soon. Stay sharp.